Hello, welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. Sensory receptors transduce stimulus energy and transmit signals to the central nervous system. Information is transmitted through the nervous system in the form of nerve impulses or action potentials, which are all or none events. An action potential triggered by light striking the eye is the same as an action potential triggered by air vibrating in the air. The ability to distinguish any type of stimulus, such as sight or sound, depends on the part of the brain that receives the action potentials. What matters is where action potentials go, not what triggers them. Sensations are action potentials that reach the brain via sensory neurons. Once the brain is aware of sensation, sensation is interprets them, giving the perception of stimuli. Perceptions such as colors, smells, sounds, and tastes are constructions formed in the brain and do not exist outside it. If a tree falls and no animal is present to hear it, is there a sound? The fall certainly produces pressure waves in the air, but if sound is defined as a perception, then there is none unless an animal senses the waves and its brain perceives them. Sensations and perceptions begin with sensory reception, the detection of a stimulus by sensory cells, which are called sensory receptors. Most sensory receptors are specialized neurons or epithelial cells that exist signally or in groups with other cell types in sensory organs, such as the eyes and ears. Extra receptors are sensory receptors that detect stimuli coming from outside the body, including heat, light, pressure, and chemicals. Interoceptors detect stimuli coming from within the body, such as blood pressure and body position. Functions performed by sensory receptors. All stimuli represent forms of energy. Sensation involves converting this energy into a change in the membrane potential of sensory receptors, which leads to a change in frequency of action potentials transmitted to the central nervous system, CNS. Sensory receptors perform four functions in this process: sensory, transduction, amplification, transmission, and integration. These functions are shown in this figure. Notice that. For two types of sensory receptors, a static receptor in a crayfish and hair cell, which detects motion in the vertebrate air, and in lateral line system of fishes and amphibians. Sensory transduction, the conversion of stimulus energy into a change in the membrane potential of a sensory receptor is called sensory transduction, and the change in membrane potential itself is known as a receptor potential. Note in this figure. Okay. Sensory reception, two mechanisms. Notice also that static receptors. Notice also muscle dendrites and static receptor and axon. Close a look. Notice also that receptor potentials are graded potentials. Their magnitude varies with the strength of the stimulus. All receptor potentials result from the opening or closing of ion chemical channels in the sensory receptor's plasma membrane, which changes the ionic permeability of the membrane. In the examples in this figure, stretching or bending of the membrane is the stimulus that causes ion channels to open or close. In other sensory receptors, channels open or close when substances outside the cell bind to proteins on the membrane, or when pigments in the sensory receptor absorb light. One amazing feature of many sensory receptors is extreme sensitivity. they can detect the smallest physical unit of stimulus possible. Mass light respirator can detect a single quantum photon, which means of light. Chemical respirators can detect a single molecular, and hair cells of the inner ear can detect a motion of only a fraction of a nanometer. Respirator sensitivity also changes with conditions. For example, the sensitivity of glucose receptors in the human mouth can vary over several orders of magnitude of sugar concentration, as both the general state of nutrition and amount of sugar in the diet change. Amplification, the strengthening of stimulus energy by cells and sensory pathways is called amplification. For example, an action potential conducted from the eye to the brain has about 100,000 times as much energy as a few photons of light that triggered it. Some amplification occurs in sensory receptors and signal transduction pathways involving signal messengers often contribute to it. Amplification may also take place in accessory structures of a complex sense organ, as when sound waves are enhanced by a factor of more than 20 before reaching receptors of the inner ear. Transmission. After energy in a stimulus has been transduced into a receptor potential, action potentials are transmitted to the CNS. Some sensory receptors, such as crayfish stretch receptor, are sensory neurons that can produce action potentials and have an axon that extends into the CNS. Others, such as hair cells, lack an axon and cannot generate action potentials themselves. These receptors release neurotransmitters at synapses with sensory neurons in almost all pathways. Where receptors synapse with sensory neurons, the receptor releases an excitatory neurotransmitter, causing the sensory neuron to transmit action potentials to the CNS. The magnitude of a receptor potential affects the frequency of action potentials that travel as sensations to the CNS. If a receptor is also a sensory neuron, a larger receptor potentials reaches the threshold sooner, resulting in more frequent action potentials. Notice that. Resulting in more frequent action potentials. If a receptor synapses with a sensory neuron, a larger receptor potential causes more neurotransmitter to be released at the synapses or that synapse, usually with the same result. Many sensory neurons spontaneously generate action potentials at a low rate. Therefore, a stimulus does not switch the production of action potentials on or off in these neurons. Rather, it modulates action potential frequency. Such neurons alert with CNS not only to the presence or absence of a stimulus, but also the change in intensity or direction. Integration. The processing or integration of sensory information begins as soon as the information is received. Receptor potential produced by stimuli delivered to different parts of sensory receptor are integrated through summation, as are postsynaptic potential in sensory neurons that synapse with multiple receptors. Another type of integration by receptors is sensory adaptation, a decrease in responsiveness during continuous stimulation, not to be confused with the evolutionary sense of term adaptation. Some receptors adapt to stimuli more quickly than others. Without sensory adaptation, you would feel every beat of your heart and every bit of clothing in your body. Receptors are selective in the information they send to the CNS, and adaptation reduces the likelihood that a maintained stimulus will result in a continuous sensation. The integration of sensory information occurs at all levels within the nervous system, and the cellular action just described are only the first steps in complex sensory structures such as the eyes have high levels of integration, and the CNS further processes all incoming signals. Types of sensory receptors. Okay, let's stop, and thanks for listening.